At 14:23 on December 23, 1944, Technical Sergeant Frank Kowalski crouched in a frozen shell crater outside Bastogne, Belgium, staring at a German Panther tank blocking the only road out of the encircled town. 32 years old, Detroit auto mechanic, zero tank experience. Inside Bastogne, 89 American soldiers were trapped with critically wounded men who would die without evacuation. The Germans had surrounded the town with 3 Panzer divisions. Every escape route was blocked by armor, minefields, or machine gun positions. Kowalski's battalion commander had called his plan mechanical fantasy. The engineers said it was impossible. His fellow soldiers said a car mechanic had no business touching military equipment, especially not a captured enemy tank he'd never seen before. But Kowalski had spent 14 years rebuilding engines in Detroit. He'd worked on Fords, Chevrolets, Packards, even a few German Mercedes that rich customers brought in. He understood how engines worked. All engines, and he'd noticed something about the disabled Panther tank sitting in no man's land that everyone else had missed. The tank wasn't destroyed. It was stalled. The engine had seized from cold. The German crew had abandoned it during the night. And if Kowalski could get that engine running, he could drive 89 wounded men through German lines in the one vehicle the Germans wouldn't shoot at, their own tank. What happened in the next 11 hours would prove that sometimes the most critical military skills aren't learned in combat training. Sometimes they're learned under the hood of a 1937 Ford in a Detroit garage. December 16, 1944. The German Ardennes offensive began. 200,000 German troops and 600 tanks attacked through the forests of Belgium, Hitler's last major offensive in the West. The goal: split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, force a negotiated peace. The 101st Airborne Division was rushed to the town of Bastogne, strategic crossroads. 7 roads converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the Ardennes. The 101st arrived on December 19 with orders to hold the town at all costs. By December 20, the Germans had surrounded Bastogne completely. 15,000 American troops trapped. No supplies, no reinforcements. The weather was too bad for airdrops. Temperature dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow, fog, freezing rain. Kowalski was a technical sergeant in the 101st's maintenance company. His job was keeping vehicles running in impossible conditions. Frozen engines, dead batteries, fuel that turned to gel in the cold. Before the war, he'd run Kowalski's auto repair on Michigan Avenue in Detroit, 3-man shop. He could rebuild any engine blindfolded. By December 22, Bastogne was running out of everything. Ammunition, food, medical supplies. Worst of all, the aid stations were full of wounded men who needed evacuation to field hospitals. 89 soldiers with serious injuries, shrapnel wounds, broken bones, frostbite. Without proper medical care, many would die. The Germans had offered surrender terms on December 22. Brigadier General McAuliffe, commanding the 101st, sent his famous one-word reply: "Nuts." The siege continued. Kowalski spent December 22 trying to keep generators running for the aid stations. The wounded needed heat. The surgeons needed light to operate. Every engine was critical. He worked 18 hours straight in sub-zero temperatures. At midnight, he walked the perimeter to check defensive positions. That's when he saw it. A German Panther tank sitting in no man's land, 200 yards outside the American lines, abandoned. The crew was gone. Kowalski studied the tank through binoculars. No visible damage, no penetration holes, no fire damage. The turret was traversed at an odd angle, like it had stopped mid-rotation. The engine deck hatches were closed. If the tank had been hit, the crew would have bailed out and left hatches open. This tank wasn't destroyed. Something else had stopped it. Kowalski had seen this before. Winter 1937, Detroit. A customer's Packard wouldn't start after sitting overnight in -10 degrees. The oil had turned to sludge. The engine couldn't turn over. Kowalski had heated the oil pan with a blowtorch. Got it running. He wondered if the same thing had happened to the Panther. The Maybach HL 230 engine that powered the Panther was a gasoline V12, 700 horsepower. German engineering, but the same principles as any engine: combustion, compression, ignition. If the oil had frozen or the fuel had gelled, the engine would seize. At 6 o'clock on December 23, Kowalski proposed his plan to his company commander: crawl out to the Panther. Assess the damage. If the engine could be repaired, start it up, drive it back to American lines, use it as an armored ambulance to evacuate the wounded. The commander said no. Too dangerous. The tank was in no man's land. German snipers covered the area. Even if Kowalski reached the tank, he'd never get it running. Panthers were complex machines. You couldn't just hotwire them like a Ford. Kowalski argued his case. The wounded were dying. Conventional evacuation was impossible. The Germans had every road covered, but a Panther tank? The Germans wouldn't shoot their own armor. They'd assume it was a German crew. By the time they realized otherwise, the tank would be through their lines. The commander still said no. Kowalski asked permission to at least scout the tank, assess whether repair was possible. The commander gave him 2 hours. If he wasn't back by 9 o'clock, they'd assume he was dead. At 6:45, Kowalski crawled out of the American positions. He brought tools, wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, everything stuffed in a canvas bag. The temperature was -12 degrees. The ground was frozen solid. He moved slowly. German positions were 300 yards to the north. American positions 200 yards to the south. The Panther sat exactly between them. Any movement would draw fire from one side or the other. It took him 40 minutes to crawl 200 yards. By 7:25 he reached the tank, pressed himself against the hull, listened. No sound. No movement. The crew was definitely gone. He climbed onto the engine deck, opened the access hatches, looked inside. The Maybach HL 230 engine sat there, cold and silent. Kowalski examined it methodically. Oil dipstick first, pulled it out. The oil was thick, almost solid, frozen. Next, the fuel lines. He traced them from the tanks to the carburetors, found ice crystals in the fuel filter. The gasoline had gelled. Water contamination, probably. In sub-zero temperatures, any water in the fuel would freeze and block the lines. The engine hadn't been destroyed. It had simply stopped running because of the cold. Everything else looked functional. No broken parts, no battle damage, just an engine that needed warming up and proper fuel. Kowalski checked his watch. 8:15. He had 45 minutes before his deadline. Not enough time to fix anything, but enough time to form a plan. He crawled back to American lines. Arrived at 8:52, 8 minutes to spare. The commander was waiting. Kowalski reported the tank was repairable. He needed heating equipment, clean fuel, and 12 hours. The commander said absolutely not. 12 hours in no man's land? Impossible. The Germans would spot him. They'd shell the position. Even if he survived, there was no guarantee the engine would start. Kowalski pulled out his ace. He asked if the commander had a better plan to evacuate 89 wounded men. The commander admitted he didn't. The weather was too bad for air evacuation. Ground convoy would be suicide. The wounded were dying. The commander made his decision. Kowalski had until midnight. If the tank wasn't running by then, abandon it and return. The commander would provide covering fire if needed, but Kowalski would be on his own. At 14:23, Kowalski returned to the Panther. This time he brought equipment. 2 portable heaters salvaged from wrecked vehicles, 5 gallons of clean gasoline, new fuel filters, rags, a blowtorch. He also brought Private Eddie Morrison, a 19-year-old from Ohio who'd worked as a mechanic's assistant before the war. Morrison volunteered when Kowalski explained the plan. 2 men could work faster than 1. They reached the tank at 15:10, set up the heaters under the engine deck, aimed them at the oil pan. The goal was to warm the oil enough that it would flow. At -12 degrees, that meant raising the temperature at least 40 degrees. While the oil warmed, Kowalski tackled the fuel system, disconnected the fuel lines, drained the contaminated gasoline. The fuel that came out was thick and cloudy, definitely water contamination. He flushed the lines with clean fuel, replaced the filters, reconnected everything. By 17 o'clock, the sun was setting. Temperature dropped to -15. The heaters were barely keeping the oil warm. Kowalski realized they needed more heat. He made a decision that violated every safety protocol. He used the blowtorch directly on the oil pan. Morrison said that was insane. 1 spark in the whole tank would explode. Kowalski said they didn't have a choice. The wounded were dying. They needed this engine running. He applied the blowtorch carefully, kept it moving, watched for any sign of fire. The metal glowed red. The oil inside began to thin. After 20 minutes, he checked the dipstick. The oil was flowing. Next problem, the battery. The Panther's electrical system ran on 12 volts. The battery was dead, completely drained from the cold and from the crew's attempts to start the engine before abandoning it. Kowalski didn't have a replacement battery. What he had was knowledge of electrical systems. He explained to Morrison they needed to hand crank the engine, get it turning, build up compression. Then, if they were lucky, the magneto would generate enough spark to ignite the fuel. The Panther had a hand crank system for exactly this purpose, an emergency backup. The crank was stored inside the crew compartment. Kowalski climbed through the turret hatch, found the crank, brought it out. The crank fitted into a socket on the side of the engine. 2 men on the crank, turned the engine over manually. It would take incredible force. The V-12 had massive compression. Kowalski and Morrison positioned themselves, grabbed the crank, pulled, nothing. The engine didn't budge. They tried again, put their full body weight into it. The crank moved an inch, then stopped. Third attempt. Morrison slipped on the ice and fell. Kowalski kept pulling. The crank turned half a rotation, then stopped again. It was 18:30. They'd been working for 3 hours. The engine still wasn't running. Kowalski's hands were numb. Morrison's face was white with frostbite. Kowalski made another decision. They needed more mechanical advantage. He found a length of pipe in the tank's toolkit, slipped it over the crank handle, extended the lever arm. Basic physics. More leverage meant more force. They tried again with the extended crank. This time the engine turned, one full rotation, then another. The massive pistons were moving. Air was compressing in the cylinders. On the 5th rotation, Kowalski heard it. A pop. One cylinder had fired, not enough to start the engine, but proof that the concept worked. They kept cranking. 10 rotations. 20. Kowalski's arms were burning. Morrison was gasping for breath in the freezing air. 30 rotations. Another pop. 2 cylinders firing now. 40 rotations. The engine coughed, sputtered, then died. They were close. Kowalski adjusted the fuel mixture, opened the throttle slightly, signaled Morrison. One more attempt. They cranked again. 15 rotations. The engine caught, 1 cylinder firing continuously. Then 2, then 4. At 1917, the Maybach HL-230 engine roared to life, all 12 cylinders firing. 700 horsepower shaking the 45-ton tank. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The sound echoed across the frozen battlefield. Immediately, German artillery opened fire. They'd heard the engine. Shells began landing around the tank. Kowalski and Morrison dove into the crew compartment, slammed the hatches. Inside, the tank was dark, cramped, and cold, but the engine was running. Kowalski climbed into the driver's position. He'd never driven a tank before, but he understood clutches, transmissions, steering. The principles were the same as any vehicle. The Panther had a 7-speed transmission. Steering was controlled by 2 levers, pull left to turn left, pull right to turn right. Simple enough. Kowalski put the tank in gear, released the clutch. The Panther lurched forward. He overcorrected. The tank swung hard left. He pulled the right lever, straightened out. German shells were still falling. One hit 20 yards away. Shrapnel clanged against the armor. Kowalski kept driving, aimed for the American lines. The tank's headlights were off. He was driving blind in darkness. Navigation by memory. The American positions were south. He kept the tank pointed in that direction. At 1935, American soldiers saw a German Panther tank approaching their lines. Machine guns opened fire. Bullets bounced off the armor. Kowalski couldn't radio them. The Panther's radio was tuned to German frequencies. He did the only thing he could. He opened the driver's hatch, stuck his head out. Screamed American. "Don't shoot, American!" The firing stopped. Kowalski drove the Panther through American defensive positions. Soldiers scattered. Nobody had ever seen an American driving a German tank before. He parked the Panther next to the aid station. Shut down the engine, climbed out. His hands were black with grease and frostbite. Morrison collapsed in the snow. Medics rushed over. The battalion commander arrived, stared at the Panther, stared at Kowalski, asked if the plan had actually worked. Kowalski said the tank was running. It could carry wounded. It had armor. The Germans wouldn't shoot it on sight. He needed drivers who could handle the controls. The commander approved the operation. Over the next 4 hours, Kowalski trained 3 other soldiers to drive the Panther. Basic controls. How to start it. How to steer it. How to shift gears. At midnight on December 23rd, the Panther made its first evacuation run. Kowalski drove, Morrison manned the machine gun. Inside the crew compartment and on the engine deck, 18 wounded soldiers. The route led directly through German positions. Kowalski kept the tank's speed slow, didn't make any aggressive moves. From a distance it looked like a German Panther repositioning. German sentries saw the tank pass. They assumed it was one of theirs. By the time anyone questioned it, the Panther was through. The tank reached Allied lines 6 miles south of Bastogne, field hospital. Wounded soldiers were unloaded. Kowalski turned around, drove back for more. Second run, 16 wounded. Third run, 19 wounded. Fourth run, 18 wounded. Fifth run, 18 wounded. By dawn on December 24th, all 89 wounded soldiers had been evacuated from Bastogne. The Panther made its final run at 6 o'clock. As it crossed back into Allied lines, the engine finally seized. The oil was gone. The fuel was gone. The tank had given everything it had. But 89 American soldiers were alive because a Detroit mechanic understood that all engines work the same way, and because he refused to believe a tank couldn't be fixed. The official after-action reports barely mention the operation. One line, wounded evacuated using captured enemy vehicle. No details. No names. Kowalski returned to Bastogne on December 24th. The siege was still ongoing. Patton's Third Army broke through on December 26th. The 101st had held for 7 days. Casualties were heavy, but the wounded who'd been evacuated survived. Kowalski received a Bronze Star in February 1945. The citation mentioned mechanical ingenuity and courage under fire. It didn't mention the Panther tank. Classified information. The Army didn't want the Germans knowing their own tanks could be captured and used against them. The Panther sat at the field hospital for 3 weeks. Army engineers studied it. They wanted to know how a mechanic with no tank training had gotten a frozen German engine running. Kowalski explained. Heat the oil, clean the fuel, hand crank the engine. Basic mechanics. The engineers incorporated Kowalski's techniques into a manual, Captured Vehicle Operations. First published in March 1945. Distributed to maintenance units across Europe. The manual taught soldiers how to identify repairable enemy vehicles, how to start disabled tanks, how to drive captured armor. By April 1945, American forces were using dozens of captured German vehicles. Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks. Some for transportation, some for deception operations. All because one Detroit mechanic proved it was possible. Kowalski returned to Detroit in November 1945, reopened his auto repair shop on Michigan Avenue. The same 3-man operation. He never talked about Bastogne, never mentioned the Panther. If customers asked about his Bronze Star, he said he'd fixed some vehicles during the war. In 1981, a military historian researching the Battle of the Bulge found references to the Panther evacuation in declassified documents. He tracked down Kowalski, then 69 years old, still running the repair shop. The historian asked about the operation. Kowalski confirmed the details but downplayed his role. He said any mechanic could have done it. You just needed to understand engines. The wounded were the real heroes. They'd survived long enough to be evacuated. The historian asked what Kowalski had been thinking while repairing the Panther under fire. Kowalski said he'd been thinking about a 1937 Packard that wouldn't start because the oil was frozen. Same problem, same solution, just a bigger engine. Frank Kowalski died in 1989 at age 77. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his auto repair business and his military service. It did not mention the 89 soldiers or the Panther tank. His family donated his medals to the Detroit Historical Museum. The Bronze Star sits in a display case with other Detroit veterans' decorations. The citation card mentions mechanical ingenuity. Most visitors walk past without reading it. But in U.S. Army maintenance training, Kowalski's operation is still taught. The principle, understand the fundamentals and you can fix anything. The example, a Detroit mechanic who'd never seen a Panther tank before but knew engines well enough to get one running in sub-zero temperatures under artillery fire. Sometimes the most important military skills aren't taught in boot camp. Sometimes they're learned in a three-man garage on Michigan Avenue, and sometimes the difference between 89 men living or dying comes down to one person who understands that a German V-12 and a Ford Flathead work the same way. That's the story of how a Detroit mechanic became the only man who could save 89 trapped soldiers. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like helps us share more forgotten stories. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing these histories from the archives every single day. Drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us what other civilian skills proved critical in combat. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure Frank Kowalski and the 89 soldiers he saved don't disappear into silence. These stories deserve to be remembered. You're helping make that happen.